Hi, this is Mary Sue again, and today we're going to do a coding camp on the excision of lesions, cysts, and tumors. So how are excisions coded? There are three things that a coder is going to look for in the documentation in order to accurately code an excision of a lesion or a mass. The origin of the mass, whether it's cutaneous or not, the depth of the mass, and the complexity of the closure. One thing providers and even coders may not know is that the RVUs for an appropriately billed layered closure are often worth more than the excision itself. That's why we try to spend so much time making sure that it's documented correctly. To give you an example of the difference, an excision of a benign lesion of the face with a simple closure is worth 1.53 RVUs. The excision of the same lesion with an intermediate closure added is worth 1.53 RVUs for the excision and an additional 2.33 RVUs for the closure. The excision of a 1 centimeter soft tissue mass is worth 2.99 RVUs because the closure is included. One thing that is important to note is that size does matter. If you don't document the size of your lesions and defects, a coder could code to the lowest level because it's not documented well. You can also see on the note to the right that for multiple lesion excisions, each one is coded separately. And then if there are layer closures, the coder will sum up all the lengths of the defects and turn in that code separately. We also talked about the point of origin. If the lesion or mass originates in the cutaneous tissue, the coder will be pointed to the lesion excision codes. If it necessitates going deeper into the subcutaneous tissues and the closure is done in multiple layers, that is where you have the addition of a layered closure CPT code. Simple closure is included in the CPT code set. For masses that reside wholly in the deeper tissues, there is another code set to use. There's a code set for masses in the soft subcutaneous tissue, and then there's a separate code set for masses in the fascia or the muscle tissue. In this code set, the simple and/or intermediate closure is included. Couple more words about closures. If the closure is confined to the dermis or the epidermis, then even if a layer closure is documented, it may not be billable as a separate code. If the closure involves separately closing subcutaneous tissue, however, or deeper layers, then layer closure is a possibility. If the closure involves other issues like debridement, unclean edges, then complex closure is possible. Here are the most common mistakes that coders and auditors see. The first is not documenting the size of the lesions or the defects. That will definitely impact RVUs and reimbursement. The second is confusing dermoid cysts with subcutaneous masses. As we learned earlier, there's a different code set for soft tissue masses, but if you use the word dermoid cyst, it's going to point the coder to the cutaneous lesion excision codes. Next is overuse of the words dermal or dermoid. We know that clinically that can mean of the skin and it can mean a wide variety of things, but again, it's going to point the coders to the lesion excision code set, and you may not want that. Similarly, using vague words like deep tissue when we don't know exactly what layer is being referred to. And then finally is only using the supplies used to close instead of describing the layered closure. And we'll look at an example of that. We just talked about using supplies in the descriptor, and here's that example. It states that the provider closed the incision with 4-0 Vicryl and then 5-0 monocryl in the skin with Dermabond. They may have meant to document layered closure, but we can't tell that from the documentation. We would have to see very clearly which tissues were closed in which manner. Similarly, here's an example of documentation of a cyst, and I circled where it said the deep layer was closed with interrupted 3-0 Vicryl sutures and the skin was closed with running 4-0 monocryl subcuticular stitch. It's evident that I think they were trying to document layer closure, but unless you say specifically what layer was closed, instead of just saying deep layer, the coder's not going to pick it up. Here's an example of really good documentation. You can see the size at the top, 9 by 5 centimeter lipoma, deep in the subcutaneous tissue and at the fascial plane. I know exactly where that mass is located. Later on in the description, it talks about encapsulated masses. So again, that points me to a soft tissue mass. And it also talks about the tendons tissue was reapproximated with 3-0 Vicryl, and then the skin was reapproximated with running intradermal sutures. So this is going to be coded as a soft tissue mass excision. So this last example is again a good one, and the main point to note here is that the post-op diagnosis was updated with what the provider found. When the patient came to the OR, the provider thought they were removing a dermoid cyst, but as it turns out, it was a right prosticular auricular lymph node that was removed, and that puts us in a different code set. The documentation is thorough. It talks about closing the subcutaneous tissue separately from closing the skin. We will put this in the soft tissue code set where originally it would have been in the lesion code set. One quick thing to note is that if you do find that your codes are significantly different than what you intended, it's always great to have a process in place to let the insurance verifiers know so that appropriate authorization can be obtained. And that's it for this quick lesson on lesions and masses. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at questions@m2revenue.com. Thanks for watching.